Hey guys, Cybel here, and I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the degradation that I do in my music, specifically cassette degradation. There's a lot of different ways you can approach this, and hopefully I can maybe give you guys a couple of neat ideas to play around with in your own stuff, or just to mess around with in general, but I personally record directly to tape. Now, if you don't want to go to cassette, you don't want to buy the equipment, the tapes, deal with any of that stuff, there are plugins you can use as an alternative. The one in particular that I have kicking around I was working with before I went to cassette is actually Isotope Vinyl. It's pretty lightweight, pretty straightforward plugin. It's leaned a little more towards the vinyl style of degradation with the oddball warping and such, but it can be an alternative to doing cassette degradation. When it comes to degrading a tape, I split it into two different categories. You have physical degradation and you have playback manipulation. Physical degradation is when the tape itself is not right. This includes either the tape is bad, it's been damaged by heat, sunlight, whatnot. It could be your playback device isn't playing it back correctly. Like an older tape deck, like my Panasonic I have back here, which is from 1968. The recording itself could just be bad. And there's also generation loss, which I'll explain in a minute. The second category is playback manipulation. That's just you physically interfere with the playback itself, but the tape itself is perfectly fine. This stuff can include things like jamming something in the way of the tape, manipulating the playback speed on the deck itself. Pretty straightforward stuff, non-destructive. You can keep the same tape in good shape for as long as you need it to. As for the actual physical degradation of your tape, there's a few different ways you can approach it. On a budget, you can always just chuck this in your car in the middle of the summer and just let it cook for days and days and days, or just leave it there for months. When you come back to it, the tape's going to be a little messed up from the sun and heat exposure, and that'll give you a warmer, garbled up sound. Another thing you can do is actually buy cheaper tape. There's three different kinds of tape that I'm aware of. There's ferro tape, chrome tape, and metal tape. And I think there's a ferrochrome in between, but nobody really sells it. But generally speaking, ferro tape is the cheapest you can buy. Your playback equipment is a very large part of the lo-fi sound. Tape decks actually are not inherently lo-fi in how they're made. It depends on how the playback on the thing works. Is the motor strong? How does it clean up the sound in post? Does it have something like Dolby or DX sound reduction? All these things kind of tie all together. Generally speaking, the cheaper your deck is, the worse it's going to sound. And if you're going for lo-fi, you probably want it to sound bad. As an example, the two decks that I use in my music, I have a Yamaha MT102. This runs for about $120 or so, I believe. It's somewhere just below the hi-fi range. It sounds nice, but you can set it to lower playback rates to give you more of a lo-fi sound. The other deck I own is a 1968 Panasonic Solid State. This thing is old. This thing is old even by cassette standards. So it's kind of weak on the playback end, so the tape is warbly, it's very warm, you don't get much treble. It's basically the ideal lo-fi sound. And I got this thing for $9, so if you're worried about it costing a lot to get into doing this kind of work, it really isn't. In cassettes, you can buy 10 packs of these things for less than 20 bucks, depending how cheap you want to go. I've seen them even like at $1 each. One thing of warning though, if you're looking at the handheld tape cassette players, they tend to have a lot of tape hiss form if you're going to record with them. I'd definitely recommend something a little bulkier, like one of these full-blown decks right here. They don't seem to have nearly as much hiss, or they have some means of you actually killing some of the hiss in post. It just kind of is a generally unpleasant sound to have introduced to a recording. Best to avoid it. One other kind of physical degradation you can do is called generation loss. This is a very old school way of degrading your tape. The way generation loss works is whenever you record something to a physical medium, to an analog medium such as cassette, or VHS, Betamax, 8-track, all that stuff, you lose a little bit of information each time it's recorded. They call it generation loss because you have your original master, and then you create a new generation of it with your next recording that is based on this one. Then if you were to record this one again onto another tape, it is another generation. What ends up happening is since you keep losing information as you go down, the tapes get increasingly warbled, you lose more tones in the high and low end, it warms up more and more each time you go down. It's a very old school way of doing it. If you have two tape decks, you can just put one in one in the other, and just keep playing the recording to the other one while that one's recording, and just keep overwriting the same part of the tape. It's pretty neat. I used to do it when I was a kid, just messing around. it can definitely create some very interesting sounds, that's for sure. When it comes to playback manipulation, there's a few little tricks you can do to mess with your tape. The one in particular that I like to do when I'm using the Yamaha, which is the higher quality of my two decks, is I'll take a guitar pick, and while it's playing back, I'll wedge it right into the teeth of the cassette. It'll cause it to not play back evenly as the motor is kind of struggling to keep up with it. And it also has a neat effect where if you're wedged into the teeth themselves, if you're in deep enough, it'll be bouncing off of the teeth, giving like a kind of steady, jumping, weird playback sound to it. This actually is really nice if you manage to time it with your tempo, and it's hitting on the offbeats of whatever you're working on. It's kind of a neat effect to work with. Alternatively, if your tape deck has a really tight housing, which a lot of the ones I've seen do, you can just wedge something, again, I'm using guitar pick as an example, it's a perfect width for this. You can just jam it underneath the tape and it'll lift it up a little bit. It'll put extra pressure on the actual roll itself on the inside, because that's still pinned to the cassette. This is something that's kind of it pulls the tape away from the recording head in there, and it causes it to be lo-fi because the tape also is looser in the process. It's pushed away from the wheel that pushes it along. So whenever there's any slack on the tape, it warbles. So you can use that to your advantage as well. You can also change on some cassette decks. Not all of them have them. The Panasonic does not, but my Yamaha does. You can change the playback speed and recording speed. The standard is 4.8, but there's also some others that are in 9.5 or higher. This is the rotation rate of the cassette itself. The higher the speed is, the more it's recording being played back. You'll be playing back a longer stretch of tape over a shorter period of time, which condenses more information to what gets sent back to you. Basically, the higher the rotation rate is, the more is being played back, more information's on it, cleaner sound, more high-end, more low-end. And don't forget, when you're doing your playback, you don't need to record and play back at the same speed. A fun thing that I've seen Heinbach do in his work is that he'll record his tape at a higher speed, like say for example the 9.5 I was talking about earlier, but then you can play it back at a lower one, like say 4.8. And if you have any knobs or faders or anything on yours for playback speed, lower it down a little bit. It's actually a really interesting way to build an atmosphere or some kind of bed to place your music on top of, and it can generally create some really cool sounds if you have the right effects to throw on top of it. Personally, I'm a really big fan of Freak Show Industries. They make some really crazy sound design-y kind of plugins. Dumpster Fire and Backmask are the two that I use from them. They have a tape one coming up soon, which I'm very excited about. But placing something like that afterwards to either mess around with the time of the tape or to violently pitch bend the ending result, it's very fun. I highly recommend you mess around with it. You can do some really cool stuff with it, especially if there are vocals on this cassette and you start pitching down. Alright, so that's what I got when it comes to messing around with cassettes. They're a lot of fun to mess with, having this physical, tangible thing to play around with and manipulate, doing stuff outside of the software. It's just very satisfying, for the lack of a better term. There's a lot of untapped potential in what you can do with these, because now that they're kind of coming back into vogue, I guess, you can get this kind of stuff readily available. And there are tape decks everywhere that, people are just trying to get rid of. Why not have fun with them? So this is Cybel, signing off. If you like this video, subscribe's right. There's a subscribe button right down there. You can just hit that button.